Look at these two people and guess where they are from. First, imagine a man with dark skin and bright blue eyes, wearing primitive clothing, standing next to a pale, light-haired man out in the desert. You might guess the first man is from somewhere near the equator. But genetic sequencing shows something very different. He is actually a Western hunter-gatherer, representing the native population of Europe roughly 10,000 years ago. And that second man? He is not European. He is a mummy from the Tarim Basin in ancient China 5,000 years ago. Back then, the global map of human physical traits did not match the borders we know today. The traits we strongly associate with specific regions right now simply did not exist in the same way in the ancient past. What we think of as the native look of a land is actually just a snapshot, a temporary result of populations moving and mixing over thousands of years. When a population lives in isolation over millennia, it establishes a distinct, steady baseline of physical traits. But that isolation rarely lasts. When war, migration, and conquest force distinct populations together, the original recipe gets overwritten by a new set of genetic instructions. These historical conquests do not all leave the same biological mark. Looking back at human history, populations typically collide and mix through three distinct mechanisms. To understand why we look the way we do, we have to examine exactly how these three mechanisms of conquest actively overrode the human blueprint. Thousands of years ago, Europe was populated by early European farmers. They had dark hair, brown eyes, and shorter builds, surviving on the crops they introduced from Anatolia. Then came the Yamnaya, nomadic herders sweeping in from the eastern steppes on horseback. This was a near-total erasure. As these steppe pastoralists pushed westward into regions like Britain, they replaced up to 90% of the local gene pool in just a few centuries. Along with cultural artifacts like the Bell Beaker vessel, they brought an entirely new physical profile to the continent. They introduced the genetics for taller stature, lighter skin, and the biological mutation required to digest milk as adults. If those nomads had stayed on the steppe, the crowds walking through London or Paris today would be significantly shorter, darker-haired, and largely lactose intolerant. The features we assume are indigenous to Northern Europe are actually the direct result of a prehistoric genetic wipeout. Now fast forward to 16th century Latin America. Before European contact, the continent possessed its own isolated genetic blueprint, built over thousands of years by its indigenous populations. That isolation ended abruptly when three distinct groups collided: Native Americans, Iberian colonizers from Europe, and enslaved Africans brought over via the transatlantic slave trade. Instead of a total replacement, this created a violent blend. The rapid depopulation of native groups due to foreign diseases, paired with forced colonial relocation, pushed these disparate populations to merge. This collision birthed the modern mestizo phenotype. It created a permanent, living mosaic of those three ancestral lines, mixing differently across various countries and communities. Without the massive population collapse triggered by European diseases, the demographic scale of the Americas would remain overwhelmingly indigenous. Today, the modern faces of the Americas serve as a living ledger, recording both indigenous survival and brutal colonial extraction. Now let us jump back to 13th century Central Asia. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire rapidly expanded to become the largest contiguous land conquest in human history. With a military machine that vast, logic suggests they should have completely rewritten the genetic code of Central Asia. But this conquest functioned as an elite overlay. The Mongol conquerors operated as a tiny ruling military class, vastly outnumbered by the Turkic subjects they had subjugated. Instead of replacing the locals, the conquerors biologically and culturally dissolved into the pre-existing genetic fabric within just a few generations. They quickly adopted the local languages and religions. Remember that pale, light-haired mummy from the desert in China? Those people, the Tocharian, vanished long before Genghis Khan, absorbed by much earlier Turkic expansions that actually had the numbers to alter the region's DNA. Extreme military dominance does not guarantee long-term genetic survival. If the conquerors lack demographic weight, the conquered ultimately absorb them. Replacement, blending, and overlays. These are the specific patterns that have restructured the human genome over the last 10,000 years. This is a DNA sequencing chromatogram, mapping out the building blocks of human genetics. It shows that the physical traits we consider traditional or native to any modern nation are really just the leftover scars and souvenirs of ancient conflicts. Because of this constant cycle of migration, mixing, and overriding, the concept of a pure human phenotype simply does not exist. Every modern face you see is walking, breathing proof of prehistoric survival and adaptation. The human genetic recipe is not finished. We are just the latest draft in an ongoing history of change. If you want to keep exploring how history shaped the biology of the world we live in, subscribe to the channel.